Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to some more Warhammer Fantasy lore, where today we are going to be talking about warrior priests. Primarily the warrior priests of Sigmar, since they are by far the most famous ones, but we'll be touching upon a couple other religions as well. So, let's start with the cult of Sigmar, shall we? The cult of Sigmar, as most of you probably know, of course, is the religion centered around the worship of Sigmar Heldenhammer as a godlike figure. Now, whether or not he's really a god, well, there's a little bit of back and forth there. On one hand, he used to be a normal person that wandered off into the mountains and presumably got eaten by orcs at some point. But he was also the founder of the Empire, and has received a fairly, well, flat-out divine status amongst most of its citizens. Back in the good old days, when he actually founded it, the Empire did not have any proper state religion per se. The most common religion was actually the Ulrician faith that worshipped the warrior god Ulric. However, these days, the cult of Sigmar has become far more powerful even than the original religion, and wields a considerable degree of both political and public power. And it, like, to be entirely honest, most religions in Warhammer Fantasy, is a rather warlike religion. Perhaps not that much of a surprise considering the sheer hostility of the Warhammer Fantasy world. And fascinating little side note. Have you ever seen concept art and such for Empire villages? You will perhaps notice that there are never any windows on the first floor, and usually only one big, heavy-looking door. That is because in Warhammer Fantasy, any house that is not in a major city is essentially expected to be a mini-castle, as it is entirely possible that it will be attacked pretty much at any point by roaming bands of bandits, goblins, orcs, chaos warriors, cultists, monsters, beastmen, the list goes on. The Warhammer Fantasy world is not a peaceful place. By contrast, you will see that in Bretonnia, the peasants are not allowed to build more than single-story buildings, because of course the peasantry have their knights to protect them. And also because the knights don't want the peasants to be able to fortify themselves, should they get any kind of silly ideas of withholding their lord's taxes or anything. And as you can probably imagine, a rather vicious environment like this breeds rather hardy people and rather harsh religions. Now, the cult of Sigmar isn't quite as harsh as the faith of Ulric. It does offer traits that we would consider to be slightly more civilized. For example, Sigmar is, first and foremost, a god that protects. The Heldenhammer holds his shielding hand over the Empire, protecting it from all of the nasty things. Mostly theoretical and spiritual protection, but hey, details. Whilst Ulric, well, he's more of a do-it-yourself kind of deity. You shouldn't be looking to Ulric to help you get through a particularly harsh winter, for example, because as far as he's concerned, if you can't get through the winter on your own, well, sorry, but you should have planned better. Fuck you. Sigmar is a little bit more nice around the edges. He's a little bit more fluffy and cozy. Not by much, but a little bit. Sigmarite priests even give out alms to the poor by feeding them, giving them clothes, and, of course, the most important thing of all, Sigmar's blessing. Because, you know, starving to death isn't that much of an issue if at least you know that you'll go to heaven afterwards. Or at least that is the opinion of the relatively well-fed priests, but hey, details. Now, this does of course not mean that Sigmar is not a rather warlike god. He has to be to really gain any kind of following in the Warhammer universe. And, of course, he's based off Sigmar Heldenhammer, a rather warlike chap who reunited the various tribes of what was to one day become the Empire. And he united most of them with a nice, big, heavy, blunt object. Occasional diplomacy, with the threat of the application of said heavy, blunt object, but mostly through the actual application of said blunt object. And fittingly enough, this trend in Sigmar's behavior led to the primary icon of his faith being a massive two-handed warhammer. As you can probably imagine from any religion that uses a big-ass fuck-off hammer as their primary symbol, they're not the friendliest of bunches, and indeed, the vast majority of Sigmarite priests are, to some extent, warrior priests. This is due to the fact that a lot of the shrines to Sigmar are located in places that are shall we say, somewhat out of the way, in the middle of the wilderness, in isolated villages, etc. There are, of course, shrines, and the biggest shrines of them all are, of course, in the major cities, but Sigmar is a god for everyone, not just the bourgeois elite. And as you can probably imagine, a shrine in the middle of the forest, filled with all manners of gold chalices and other religious paraphernalia, not to mention a massive golden warhammer, which is quite frequently the icon of the shrine, it does attract a fair bit of unwanted attention from those who are down on their luck and might find a use for some gold paraphernalia other than simply having it standing around collecting dust. And that is, of course, only one of the many reasons that many factions would have for desecrating a Temple of Sigmar. The purely economical one is probably the one most favoured by common bandits, whilst a roaming band of beastmen or a small chaos warband might have far more, religious reasons for bursting into the temple and shitting all over the altar. Hell, even your average orc warband has a certain sense of humour and would find the idea of desecrating a Temple of Sigmar by shoving the warhammer up the head priest's arse to be downright fucking hilarious, and definitely worth risking one's life for. And this, of course, all means that any devotee of Sigmar that has any plans to live beyond the ripe old age of 20 has to have some way of dealing with these occupational hazards. And just like good Christians, they too ask themselves, what would Jesus do? Except, of course, in this case, Jesus is a hammer-wielding barbarian who reunited the various tribes of humankind with said heavy blunt object. As such, the answer to the question, what would Jesus do, is almost always hit it with a hammer until it stops moving. Which, to be fair, is not a bad mantra. There are very few problems in this world that cannot be solved with the correct application of blunt force trauma. Admittedly, it might not always be the perfect solution, but it is almost always a solution. Starving peasants, for example. Now, the ideal solution would be to give them bread, but an alternative solution would be to apply said blunt force trauma to one of the peasants' skull, thereby creating a surplus of food for the other peasants. Like I said, it might not be the ideal solution, but it is most certainly a solution. Now, of course, there are exceptions to the hammer-wielding ideology. For example, priests that serve in cult temples in major cities are rarely expected to have to beat anything to death with a hammer. Of course, these are still, however, expected to be at least passably trained in the usage of a hammer, as Sigmar demands that all of his followers fight evil wherever they may find it. Granted, in many of these cases, it is a symbolic fight, for example, to fight against suffering by providing relief to the peasants. Usually, this relief does take the form of good old-fashioned bread rather than a beating, luckily. Otherwise, even the cult of Sigmar would probably have a hard time retaining its followers for particularly long. But the fact still remains that, technically speaking, every single priest of the cult of Sigmar is a warrior priest. However, as far as we are concerned, there is a rather stark contrast between the quote-unquote warrior priest that serves in a temple in some major city whose greatest act against evil in the world is handing out bread, and a warrior priest that wears full-on plate armor and bashes chaos warriors over the head. And indeed, the cult itself does make a distinction between the two. Now, as previously mentioned, all of them are expected to have some martial traditions, but not all are expected to actually be sent out to fight. This is the duty of I should probably say, somewhat Templar-esque formation within the cult itself. Now, do not misunderstand, they are not actual Templars as in Knight Templars, and they do not hold official office as Templars. It is simply a unofficial distinction within the order between those who are actual warrior priests and those who are quote-unquote warrior priests. There are also a couple further distinctions. That is, of course, between the warrior priest that is currently in active service. These are usually seconded to imperial armies, garrisons, or other areas where they can rile up and restore the troops' faith in dire hours, etc. Or they might be seconded to small villages that are particularly exposed to, shall we say, the various hazards of living in the imperial countryside. And then, of course, there are also the witch hunters. Many priests of Sigmar that consider themselves to be more of a warlike persuasion decide to take up the mantle of witch hunters and kind of do a dual purpose kind of thing, where they are both wandering warrior priests and witch hunters. They will essentially use whichever title serves them the best in any given scenario. As I talked about in my Witch Hunters video, there are quite a few different variants of Witch Hunter. One might, for example, work for a state, for a government, for a local council, a local noble. Some might even work for private people to investigate certain occurrences. Others might work more or less officially, quote-unquote, for the church. And in some cases, in the case of witch hunters that are literally Sigmarite priests, they cannot be considered to be officially working for the church in a capacity as witch hunters, but that is of course mostly a technicality. And certainly it is a technicality that most loyal Sons of the Empire wouldn't give too much of a shit about, because warrior priests make pretty goddamn good witch hunters, as not only do they have access to a very heavy hammer, they also often have access to various spells, or, well, they will of course call them miracles. For all intents and purposes, they are magic, and thusly, by definition, they are chaos magic, as all magic, of course, comes from the warp and chaos, but, well, I dare you to tell that to a witch hunter. You are unlikely to tell him twice, and, we'll leave it at that. There are several different orders within the Sigmarite Church that focus on different things. For example, the Order of the Anvil and the Torch. This is the single largest of the cults, and it practices defensive rites. This usually focuses upon the protection of the body, and of course, the spirit, from the harmful effects or influences of chaos corruption. This can, for example, be used to ward off malignant influences that might be affecting a township, or to root out witches, because of course they can smell the evildoers. And they actually can to a certain extent. At the very least, they can quite often detect chaos influences upon individuals or even entire hamlets if it's strong enough, but the influence needs to be fairly powerful before they can detect it for sure. Of course, being sure has never stopped an Inquisitor, now has it? So, you know, as long as you're relatively certain, that's usually good enough. But of course, nothing will ever be achieved if one purely stays on the defensive. That is why there is also the Order of the Silver Hammer. This has, how should we say, it's got some of the same ideas as the previous order, where they too, of course, wish to protect civilization against the warping influence of chaos. Except, whilst the previous one would do so by preventing the influence of chaos in the first place and protecting against it, the Order of the Silver Hammer states that the best defense is a good old-fashioned offense, and teaches that the best way to protect against such monstrosities is simply to murder them in the most vicious and graphic manner possible. Because after you viciously disemboweled one heretic with a hammer, and trust me, it takes a lot of effort to disembowel somebody with a hammer, the second heretic is rather likely to start reconsidering his life choices. Now, of course, he can't ever be forgiven for being a heretic, but luckily, whilst he may not receive any forgiveness on the mortal plane, Sigmar above will surely be able to cleanse his soul. As long as it's been properly prepared on the mortal realm, of course, either through the application of, again, blunt force trauma, or, preferably, fire, because as we all know, fire cleanses. And speaking of the devil, the third and final order is the Order of the Cleansing Flames. I'll give you 3 chances to guess what their central doctrine is. I'll give you a little hint. It includes several logs of firewood and a torch. It's not much of a riddle, is it? But what you might not expect is that they primarily burn to death, cleanse, other members of the cult of Sigmar. They are essentially a internal police force, their very own little mini-inquisition, if you will. Now, of course, don't get me wrong, they will happily burn other witches as well, but primarily they're around to burn traitors within their own ranks. But what about the other warrior priests? I did promise something that wasn't just the cult of Sigmar. Well, what about the warrior priests of Ulric? This one's rather interesting because whilst, of course, again, in the cult of Sigmar, every member is expected to be, at least a halfway passable fighter, the warrior priests of Ulric are all warrior priests of Ulric. There are no soft city preachers in this faith. There are no mewling bastards who simply hand out bread or anything like that. No. Theirs is a far more, how do I put it, private religion, perhaps? I don't want to use the word savage, but, well, it does kind of fit. Whilst the cult of Sigmar is a proper, large-scale, organized religion, the warrior priests of Ulric are far more, how do I even say it? What would be the good term? Native, perhaps? Private, personal, small scale? They do have temples, and some of them are even fairly large, and they do of course have their own centers of power, of course primarily up in Middenheim, but they don't have anywhere near the organization of the cult of Sigmar. They prefer to have wandering preachers rather than actual shrines, for example, in various villages. This means, of course, that the warrior priests of Ulric are even more exposed than those of the cult of Sigmar, because at least the warrior priests of Sigmar, if they are stationed at a church, they've got a church to hide inside of, and again, considering how hostile the Warhammer worlds can be, it's usually going to be made rather solidly. We're talking a pretty big, heavily fortified stone house with a nice big massive doors, arrow slits, and secondary fortifications. Practically a mini castle that pretends to be a church. Additionally, they are often defended not only by the priest and his sub-priest themselves, they also often have small garrison, quote-unquote, of Templar knights. Now, we're not talking large numbers, we're talking, 1, 2, or 3, but still, knights are still knights. We're talking people in very solid armor with a lot of martial experience and actual proper weapons, which might make all the difference against a bunch of marauding ruffians or retarded beastmen who can barely construct ladders if they are forced to do so. Whilst the warrior priests of Ulric, on the other hand, the only fortifications they're likely to be able to call upon is whatever armor they are currently wearing, and the only additional strength they're likely to be able to call upon is those of their own arms. Now, there are warrior Templar orders of Ulric as well, for the Knights of the White Wolf, for example, but they are primarily stationed in the much larger temples, in the primary cities, and even then it's considered to be, well, not exactly an honorable assignment. It's not dishonorable either, it's not a punishment, but, a true follower of Ulric shouldn't be standing behind some stone walls waiting for the enemy to come to them. Oh no, not at all. Instead, the followers of Ulric should go find the enemy and viciously murder them, preferably with massive two-handed axes, or occasionally hammers. The whole hammer shtick's kind of been taken away from them by the whole Cult of Sigmar thing, but, they'll still use them. It still makes nice squishy noises when it hits people, after all. But so far, we've only covered the nice warrior priests, haven't we? The good guys, quote-unquote. And I add in the quotation marks there because, to be fair, an Ulrician warrior priest would happily watch you starve to death. It would just mean that you're weak, which, doesn't really qualify for the good guy staple, but it's fine, it's okay. Because compared to who we're going to be looking at next, that's still pretty alright. Because you see, the good guys do not have a monopoly on warrior priests. One that would fit the description rather neatly, in fact, serves Khorne. Khorne has a very unofficial order, because Khorne doesn't really do anything officially. He's fucking Khorne. If Khorne was to run a bureaucracy, it would, it'd be damn interesting while it lasted, but it wouldn't last particularly long, as the various functionaries would try to murder each other with the biggest, spikiest bats they could get their hands on. But despite that, even though Ruinous powers do have shrines. In the case of Nurgle, shrines to Nurgle is, well, piles of shit. Doesn't require a whole lot of maintenance. In the case of Slanesh, his shrines are more, shall we say, decadent, and, well, the entire point of being decadent and indulging one's desire is resisting the urge to clean up, because, very few people actually have a desire to clean up. It's not really something you do out of, enjoyment. What would even that look like? The desire to clean up taken to the extreme, which is the natural endpoint of the Nesh. I guess exterminatus? I mean, think about it. With all of those damn humans about, it's never gonna be truly clean. Huh. Wow. I took the subject of cleaning up and turned it into we must ausrotten all of the humans. Even I'm vaguely impressed by that segue. Huh. Anyways, moving on. And Tzeentch, well, he's the god of change. And so you can't really have a temple to Tzeentch because he's all about change. If you have a temple, that implies a certain consistency, doesn't it? Because it's going to be a temple, and it's going to be in one spot, without moving. Not really the Tzeentchian way. That leaves us with Khorne, and you might think that he'd be the least, likely of the three, but actually, you would be wrong. In fact, Khorne is quite fond of temples because it's one of his central doctrines, the whole skulls and skull throne thing. Now, of course, again, when I'm saying Khorne a temple, I don't mean anything like an actual church or a building of any sort. I mean something along the lines of a large stone slab as a ritual offering slab, and a bunch of skulls, maybe with a couple other large rocks around the area with some fancy little runes dabbed upon them. It's not much in the sense of the civilized world, but it is a temple, quote-unquote, to Khorne, and he even has his own little warrior priests. These guys do not really go for any real specific classification. They don't have orders, they don't have their own little names, they don't have a book club or anything. They are simply warrior priests of Khorne. They know, instinctively apparently, where the various shrines are, and they will wander from shrine to shrine and maintain them, whilst of course chopping the heads of anybody they meet on the way and bringing the skulls along with them. I can't help but imagine a particularly busy warrior priest dragging a massive rucksack filled to the brim with heads behind him, just having to stop every 50 meters and catch his breath like, I wish I hadn't killed that last fat merchant. I also imagine said priest immediately turning into a chaos spawn for even thinking the thought that there can ever be too many skulls. Oh, and do bear in mind, whilst I've said here that Khorne is the only one that has temples, I mean that as in the context of he's the only one that really has god-sanctioned temples, with a quote-unquote priesthood dedicated to their upkeep and their maintenance, with both upkeep and maintenance in heavy quotation marks. But, of course, there are other shrines to the various gods, along with, of course, the most common being shrines to Chaos Undivided. Usually these are crude stone pillars erected by beastmen in the middle of the woods, and, well, you can argue whether or not that really defines as a temple, but the beastmen think it is, and besides, those fuckers can't build anything, so the fact that they have the sheer tenacity and architectural ingenuity to take a large rock and put it on its side, well, that's pretty impressive as far as beastmen architecture goes. There are also several temples built by the various Norscan tribes, but these are not, technically speaking, dedicated to the Chaos gods. Rather, these will be dedicated to one of the many sham personalities of the Chaos gods, like, for example, their god of the drowned dead, which is basically Nurgle, or their raven god, which is Tzeentch, and so on. So, in all due technicality, these aren't really temples to the Chaos god, but, you know, for all intents and purposes. And as you can probably imagine, these temples work a little bit differently than the two other examples. Granted, a faithful of Ulric will happily watch you freeze to death on a cold winter night because you should have prepared better. A Chaos Priest will, well, I don't even really need to tell you, do I? Nor are they likely to hand out bread to the poor at any point in time. In fact, they are exceedingly unlikely to be offering any form of charity whatsoever, unless you consider getting your head chopped off to be some form of charity, which, in the vast majority of circumstances, I probably don't think it is. Come to think of it, the Khorne warrior priests really are the least useful of the bunch. I mean, Sigmar warrior priests, they'll travel with the army, they'll embolden the men and tell them to not fear the darkness, because their eternal souls are blessed and protected. Even the Ulrician warrior priests might at least offer a token prayer on the behalf of those they're fighting alongside. The Khorne warrior priest, I mean, what can he promise you? Your soul's going to hell? Pretty much regardless of what you do here? I mean, as far as I know, the only one that can actually bring souls directly to Khorne at quote-unquote paradise, being Khorne Citadel, where they will fight to the death every day and then be resurrected, is Valka, so you can't really offer that either. Though, to be fair, these warrior priests have attracted a modicum of Khorne's attention. That's why they've become warrior priests of Khorne. Therefore, if you stick nearby one for long enough, there is also the tiny chance that Khorne might notice you while he's looking at the priest, which could potentially gain you a, well, blessing, quote-unquote. It's the exact same type of, and I hesitate to use the word logic here, but I guess it's the best one to use, where very powerful warriors of chaos will gather around them large followings of wannabe warriors of chaos, hoping that in all of the kerfuffle of combat, the god, whilst checking in on his favoured champion, might notice some of their exploits as well. The downside to all of this is, of course, that it is still a warrior priest of Khorne, and he is quite literally bound by holy oath, well, unholy oath, I suppose, to chop the head off anybody he meets, which is going to make it quite the challenge to follow him around the countryside. But maybe, just maybe, that's the test. Maybe, just maybe, if you manage to follow him around the countryside for long enough, Khorne Senpai will finally notice you. Unfucking likely, but hey, who am I to crush somebody's hope? And with that, I'll be wrapping up this video on warrior priests. We've had a look at the Sigmarite version, the Ulric version, and a little bit on the Khorne version. The last two have, well, we don't have that much information on them. The Ulrician faith is, somewhat private, shall we say, and as for the Khorne followers, well, as you can probably imagine, keeping records and writing books and registries and actually codifying what they're doing is not particularly high on the list of priorities for a follower of Khorne. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.